This podcast serves Middle Tennessee every weekday morning, and it's made possible by member support. Learn how you can make a difference at WPLN.org/support.
This is the Nashvillager Podcast. It's October 16th, 2025. Today in Washington, D.C., the U.S. Supreme Court is scheduled to continue hearing arguments in a case from Louisiana that could strip protections for minority voters from the Voting Rights Act. I'm Nina Cardona, and this is your daily digest of what's happening around Middle Tennessee with context from Nashville Public Radio, WPLN News. The right to vote is one of the most fundamental and fraught rights we have in the United States. Ronald Reagan called it the crown jewel of American liberties. And as important as it is, from the start of this nation, there's always been a certain degree of caution, too, a sense that it shouldn't be given to the wrong people. Initially, the supposedly wrong people were folks who didn't own property, women, and Black people. But of course, after a lot of intense work by and advocacy for those populations, we now let almost every adult who is a citizen cast a ballot. The protections aren't always what they should be. There's a lot to argue about the real-world access that people have to voter registration and the polls, or the ways that voter lists are sometimes called. But theoretically, every grown-up has a chance to vote unless the courts have taken that right away as punishment for committing a felony. Now, that is not always a permanent loss. I've talked before on this podcast about voting rights restoration here in Tennessee and how this state sets a particularly high bar with an especially complicated process for getting the ability to vote again after serving a sentence. And you might recall that we saw some confusion about this in last year's election cycle. There was a lawsuit over the state's reenfranchisement rules, and after dueling motions and all kinds of back and forth, at the last minute, a judge ruled that people involved in the case should be allowed to vote. But the timing made it really unclear if their votes would be counted or not. Ultimately, they were. But then the case went to appeal. And, well, my point is that it's a pretty heated issue. You may also recall that in the last couple of election cycles, the Tennessee GOP has been getting more and more concerned with making sure that the only people involved in their primaries are true blue Republicans. That's kind of a tricky thing to prove in a state like ours that does not have voters register their party affiliation. But the law does specify that you should be a so-called bona fide member of a party to cast a ballot in their primary. A judge has ruled that the state can post signs reminding people of that law. And after last year's election, a couple of ousted lawmakers tried to challenge their primary losses on the argument that they thought Democrats crossed over to vote against them in the Republican primary. Now, there are limits to what the parties can do about voters coming in from the community at large to take part in a primary, but they are able to add an extra layer of control over who runs in those party elections. And that brings me to a man who pulls all of these threads together in one place. Former Rutherford County Sheriff Robert Arnold. Arnold has just announced that he's running for Congress. He's a Republican, and he intends to challenge the GOP incumbent in the 4th District, Scott DesJarlais. But Arnold is also a convicted felon. He ran a company that illegally made money off of his position as the ultimate boss of the Rutherford County Jail. Those were federal corruption charges. He pled guilty and was sentenced to prison time. And because that's a felony, he lost the right to vote in Tennessee. What's more, there's a certain list of crimes for which you permanently lose the right. And sure enough, that includes misconduct involving public officials and employees or interference with government operations. I'm pretty sure abusing the office of sheriff falls under that umbrella. Now, as far as I can see, there is nothing in federal or state law barring a convicted felon from running for Congress. But the bylaws of the Tennessee GOP go farther, a lot farther. Article 9 of the party's rules say candidates for Republican primaries need to be actively involved by attending party meetings, working on other campaigns, or taking part in actions of one of the GOP's auxiliary groups. They say candidates need to be active voters. They must have voted in at least 3 of the 4 most recent statewide primaries in which they were eligible. And they have to be registered to vote. There's no qualifiers on that last point. No, if you're eligible. No, it just says voter registration is a must. Arnold can't do that. He's not allowed by law. Now, party rules aren't the law. The party can change its restrictions or grant some kind of waiver. It will be interesting to see if the leadership wants to do that for Robert Arnold. It may be that they decide his past is too much of a problem and there's no good reason to bend for him. Or they could decide everyone loves a redemption arc, so why not give him another chance? But man, the fact that this is happening in the 4th District is pretty interesting, because while the incumbent is no felon, he does have a track record that I'm pretty sure party leadership would rather most people just ignore. Scott Desjardins doesn't show up in the press much anymore, but in his first few elections, his private life was all over the headlines. He won his seat in 2010 on a tidal wave of GOP support despite the discovery of allegations put forward during his divorce proceedings. His ex-wife accused him of physical harassment and intimidation, including holding a gun in his mouth while threatening to shoot himself in front of her. Then, in his 2014 re-election, his former mistress said the pro-life Republican had pressured her to get an abortion. So, if Arnold is allowed to run, and if next year's District 4 primary turns into a battle of the backstories, the attack ads could be intense. In just a few minutes, a new look at one town's last public lynching. That's coming up after the newscast.
I like to say Nashvillager in the morning. This is Nashville in the afternoon. I'm Blake Farmer, the new host, and yes, WPLN's midday show is also a podcast, and we understand lunchtime listening may not be your thing, but that doesn't mean you have to sit out. You can listen wherever you get your podcast, like right here, or ask your smart speaker to play the latest episode of This is Nashville.
Here's the latest from WPLN News. Authorities have not yet determined the cause of the weapons manufacturer explosion that killed 16 people in Bucksnort last week. Humphreys County Sheriff Chris Davis says that the investigation is proceeding slowly and methodically because of the size of the scene and the risk to first responders.
We just don't know how long this is going to take. We're going to be here a long time.
The ATF confirmed that they have removed hazardous materials and live explosives from the scene. So far, investigators have identified 14 of the 16 victims. Immigrant communities in Memphis are in crisis mode following mass traffic stops and detentions by federal agents. A collection of federal agencies, including ICE, known as the Memphis Safe Task Force, arrived in the city in late September. Since then, the Commercial Appeal reports hundreds of people have been detained for immigration reasons. Recent court rulings have made it easier for immigration officials to stop someone based solely on race, language, location, and occupation. And advocates say that once someone has been detained, it can be difficult for their families and lawyers to figure out where they have been sent. The Middle Tennessee District Attorney in hot water for shooting at a fugitive is resigning his post. Chris Stanford has been the chief prosecutor for Van Buren and Warren counties since 2022. Last November, he was trying to apprehend a man accused of a triple homicide when he gave chase and fired at the suspect. He was later charged with felony reckless endangerment. The indictment says the lawyer did not aim his gun or make use of its sights, just held it out and shot, like you might see in an action movie. The bullet shot through the wall of a nearby home. A mother and her 3 children were inside, but nobody was injured. Meharry Medical College has successfully fought for the reinstatement of $25 million in federal grants. That's roughly half the National Institutes of Health funding that was frozen or taken away from Meharry soon after President Donald Trump took office. The form letter sent to explain the funding loss mentioned diversity, equity, and inclusion. Meharry is a historically black institution with a strong focus on reducing health disparities across demographic groups. The Nashville Business Journal reports the school's administration held multiple meetings with lawmakers and policy advisors to advocate the funding to be restored. 4 federal grants are still terminated, including $11 million for digital studies and smaller amounts related to HIV and AIDS research, women's studies, and support for new faculty. Nashville's facing a dilemma. How can the city accommodate its rapid growth? With a severe housing shortage, planners are trying to get creative. One approach is to loosen zoning restrictions, the rules on what can be built and where. But this has prompted a fiery debate between those in favor of zoning reform and those against. Some, like Ben Vaught, a former NDOT engineer, feel it is essential to remove barriers.
Zoning really only has the power to say no. And we have mandated the most expensive form of housing available, a single-family home, in the majority of the city. And we've relegated multifamily housing to directly on state highways or abutting interstates. Like, we use multifamily housing as a buffer.
Others, like Chris Remke, a development consultant, argue that changing the zoning code would fail to create more affordable housing, which is often the goal. This is what he says about loosening the code.
This results in luxury housing and high taxes and high property values, speculation. So now corporate ownership comes in and buys in what has traditionally been individually owned wealth-building families.
Ben Vaught and Chris Remke both appeared on WPLN's This is Nashville earlier this week to discuss zoning reform. You can hear the full episode at WPLN.org. Food insecurity is on the rise in Davidson County, and it's especially pronounced in North Nashville. With food costs going up and food assistance getting cut, even some middle-class families are worried about putting food on the table. That's why Metro Social Services Director Renee Pratt canceled her retirement, according to the Nashville Banner. The agency held a pop-up event in North Nashville a few weeks ago. People started lining up at 6 in the morning, and the 300 pantry boxes Metro brought were handed out in just 15 minutes. The historically black neighborhood has faced economic distress since the 1960s, when the I-40 interstate project ravaged the area. Much of it is considered a food desert. One of its few stores, Save-A-Lot on Clarksville Pike, became notorious for running out of food. Another, a Kroger off Rosa Parks Boulevard, suddenly closed for renovations in April and is still shuttered. The city launched a food desert initiative this year and is reviewing about 30 project proposals. A judge has ordered that the prime downtown property that long housed Nashville's Central Church of Christ will be sold. The building is just a block away from Lower Broadway and the Ryman Auditorium. It was at the center of a lawsuit between a ministry that took over the space after the congregation stopped meeting there and Christian music star Amy Grant and her family, descendants of a man who funded the construction of that church. The original deed, dating back to 1925, stated that if it ever ceased to be a house of worship, the land should revert to the family. The Nashville Business Journal reports the court ruled that the property should be sold with the majority of the proceeds going to the family. A statement from Grant says they intend to find some kind of, quote, philanthropic outcome for the property. The ministry will retain ownership of the adjacent parking lots, which generate an estimated income of $42,000 a month. You'll find more news anytime at WPLN.org. Nearly 90 years ago, Rainey Bethia was tried and hanged as thousands watched along the banks of the Ohio River in Owensboro. Now his death, the last public hanging in the U.S., is at the center of a new book that examines lynching culture in America. For the Appalachian Mid-South Newsroom, Derek Operly has this story.
Everybody went, everybody had a wonderful time, and it was over just like that.
In a 2013 Davis County Public Library interview, the late Bill Shelton painted a shocking picture of the scene from Rainey Bethia's hanging. He remembers the festive atmosphere, the sea of people gathered around the scaffolding as Bethia walked calmly to his death.
They came from everywhere, and there was hawkers. They sold sandwiches, and they sold Coca-Colas, and you'd have thought it was a big picnic or something.
In her new book, American Bloodlines, Owensboro native Sonia Lee examines the 1936 case through court records, contemporary reporting, and her own family history. Lee was inspired to look into the case after learning her grandparents attended the hanging as newlyweds, and in her research, she learned she was related to the prosecuting attorney. She says it's made her think harder about racial violence and that it's not hard to draw a line from Bethia's execution to the police killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd.
There's just so many things layered up where things could have been different for Rainey Bethia. But at the same time, we can start to see the connections, how racial violence is still evident in our communities.
On a summer morning in 1936, a 70-year-old white woman named Elza Edwards was found dead in her Owensboro home. A local doctor determined she'd been strangled and raped, and 2 days later, authorities shifted the investigation to Bethia, a man in his 20s who Edwards had hired to work in her home. Lee says the evidence against Bethia was flimsy, and that his multiple confessions may have been coerced.
One of the things that we can do through this case is to look and see how it might have been possible that justice would have been done. And that just takes a little bit of curiosity.
4 attorneys were appointed to represent Bethia during the rushed legal proceedings, including the son of the presiding judge. The Commonwealth's attorney chose not to prosecute Bethia for murder, which would have carried a sentence of death by electric chair. Instead, they sought a public execution under an archaic Kentucky law.
They brought an old law out of hiding so that they could then try for rape alone and hang.
After just 4.5 minutes of deliberation by an all-white jury, Bethia was found guilty. During the trial, his defense counsel called no witnesses and delivered no closing argument. A little more than 2 months passed between Edward's death and Bethia's hanging, and in the run-up, a media circus descended on the town. Most of it focused not on Bethia or the details of the case, but instead on Florence Thompson, who had succeeded her husband as sheriff after his death just months earlier. The skirted sheriff, as she was known, was expected by many to be the executioner, though she didn't end up going through with it herself. Still, the spectacle drew around 20,000 people, enough to nearly fill modern-day Rupp Arena in Lexington. Today, there is no historical marker on the riverfront where Bethia was executed. That's something Rondalyn Randolph, local NAACP president and leader of the Owensboro Community Remembrance Project, has wanted to do for more than a decade.
It shows a respect to Rainey's humanity. It shows that our community is not that community anymore, and we're able to move forward by doing, the right thing.
Lee is hopeful that her book and continued local efforts can ensure that this piece of local history doesn't fade from memory. For the Appalachia Mid-South Newsroom, I'm Derek Operly.
That story, of course, brought to us by way of the Appalachia Mid-South Newsroom, which is a collaboration between 7 public radio stations, including WPLN News and NPR, to bring the region's news to all of us. We do this roundup of news every weekday, so subscribe in your favorite podcasting app to make sure you never miss an episode. And if you like this, you'll probably enjoy the Nashvillager newsletter, too. You'll get perspective from more of my colleagues at Nashville Public Radio and links to the stories we're following. Sign up for those daily emails at WPLN.org/NashVillager. Thanks so much for listening. Let's make this day a good one, and we'll catch back up tomorrow.